for just a couple of months, but previously I was doing all of our stormwater and drainage projects. But tonight we are here for the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or MVP, as we will refer to it as. The town received a grant just a couple of months ago that allows us basically to look a little bit more proactively about our changing climate and talk about things like flooding, intense storms, drought, and heat waves, which you'll see on these boards around the room. So tonight we're utilizing our consultant, KLA, or Kim Lundgren Associates, and they are here to help us facilitate this process. They're going to help us walk through all of these different climate hazards and what the town is doing and how we're going to move forward talking about climate change and climate hazards and its impact on our residents. So without much further ado, I will introduce Angie, and she's going to help us facilitate the rest of the evening.
Claire. Again, Angela Cleveland. I am the Director of Sustainability Planning for Kim Lundgren Associates. We were hired to assist the town over the next, I guess it's been about 5 or 6 months total working on this project. But I'm also joined by my 2 colleagues, and I'll let them introduce themselves. And then we'd love to do a round of introductions so that we can see also who's in the audience today. We'd love to hear where you're coming from. So really, really short, but your name, where you're coming from, and what you're hoping to get out tonight. So I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves first.
Hi, I'm Mike Steinhoff. I'm a technical director at Kim Lundgren Associates.
And I'm Maggie Beard, also at KLA, and work on a lot of the project and communication side of things.
Hi, I'm Julie Smith-Gallagher, and I'm a Wakefield Town Council.
I'm Rob Whittick. I moved to Wakefield because I like Quantum Power. So I want to be able to row out there and enjoy it.
Awesome.
Sylvia Sharp, Wakefield resident.
You want to start it?
To say what I expect. I'm just excited that this is happening.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Robin Greenberg, I'm a member of the Sustainable Wakefield Committee for the town.
Great.
James Warren, Wakefield resident.
Great.
Maureen Palomino, I'm a Wakefield resident and a member of the advisory board.
Maureen Miller, Wakefield resident, director of Wakefield Food Pantry.
Great, thanks.
Meg Michaels, I moved to Wakefield because of Wakefield Power.
Awesome.
I'm Jen McDonald. I'm an employee of the town, and I was in the last focus group session, so interested in seeing how the project can be.
Thanks, Jen.
Jen Cockmore, I'm a Wakefield resident.
Great.
Dan Cockmore, Wakefield resident.
Chris Video, I'm a Wakefield resident and involved in climate issues, environmental health scientists. So excited this is happening.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
I'm Carol, Wakefield resident, part of the grassroots Sustainable Wakefield, and part of First Baptist Rebuild, and helped us Salem Star, and studied this for the last few years.
Oh, great. Great. So we got some experts in the room to help us out with some of the discussions. That's awesome.
I'm David, I'm a Wakefield resident, and I guess I could say I've been concerned about energy and sustainability most of my life, so I'm excited to see this happening too.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ed Delmarowski. I'm a member of the Wakefield Town Council and certainly a Wakefield resident.
Marsha Alter, I'm a Wakefield resident.
Marsha. And the 2 that just joined us, your name and affiliation?
Affiliation, Bobby, Wakefield resident.
Great.
Nice
That's a great resident, or great affiliation.
And I'm Barbara Worley, Wakefield resident.
Awesome. Great. So we have a couple others that are just joining us, so I won't put them on the spot. I'll go over the agenda first, and I'll let them get settled. So we are going to do a quick presentation tonight. The majority of this is really, as Claire mentioned, to get some feedback from you on the hazards that were identified. And we identified 4 main hazards. It doesn't mean that other hazards are not affecting Wakefield, but the 4 that we wanted to dig into as part of this Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program and envision Wakefield resilient over the next several months. So we'll introduce what the MVP program is in case people are not familiar with that. And as Claire said, we'll probably be calling it MVP. But it is Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. It's a big mouthful, and sometimes I stumble over myself a little bit, so I try to say MVP. We'll go through those climate hazards and the impacts that are projected for those, although they're also on here. So don't feel like you need to memorize anything tonight. A lot of this is going to be repeated on the boards, but we wanted to start that conversation at least to set a baseline, if you will, for tonight. And then we'll look at the workshop highlights. There was a couple people mentioned that they were at workshops we did back in June with stakeholders throughout Wakefield to start to dig into those hazards and what are the assets in Wakefield that are currently impacted and that we project to be impacted by these hazards in the future. We'll talk about the effort of Envision Wakefield Resilient with a couple of slides, and then we'll open this up with some instructions on the open house. So this is about a 2-year program now. This past year was, there's a significant amount of money for communities statewide, and this is a really big emphasis that I'd like to make because before a lot of climate work, especially vulnerability assessment work, was only applicable to our coastal communities, and there are only 78 of those. So as you can imagine, the rest of the state also needs to be addressing this because other climate hazards like heat and drought and intense storms are affecting our communities. And so this pot of money through the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program is really starting to prepare communities in a pretty big way to address these things. So we have a 5-step program. So engaging the community, we mentioned the workshops that happened back in June, and now we're doing this with these listening sessions. We did identify climate change hazards, and we're going to discuss those tonight, and looked at really what both the vulnerabilities and the strengths. I think it's really important to recognize that Wakefield is already strong to some of these things, and so how can we enhance those strengths and also work together to continue to enhance strengths that you're already powerful in. So we don't want to think that it's all about us being weak. There are some strong points, a lot of them in Wakefield. So how do we make sure we bring those to the top? And we did develop some actions that we're going to be presenting. A lot of these are really important to identify because there's additional money out there. In fact, in April of this last year, actually end of March of this last year, $10 million additional dollars were dedicated to this project, and we're anticipating another very big, significant round of money to be available in September through what they called action grants. So this is the final kind of step, if you will, for Wakefield to go through for this MVP process, and then you'll be what's called a certified program, a certified MVP program. So you'll be eligible for that large pot of action grant money, which will help you with further planning efforts, with what we call green infrastructure or natural-based solutions. There's a lot of different things that we can do with that money. So a couple terms that we're going to toss around tonight, and I'm not going to read through each and every one of these, but they're important to kind of set a baseline for what we talk about. So a couple of them that are important to highlight are things like intense storms. If you've been involved with climate work, which it sounds like a couple of you are, these are individually sometimes called out as their own hazards: nor'easters, ice storms, extreme precipitation, hurricanes. We grouped them into one category because they do tend to be very similar in how they impact the community, especially with emergency preparedness and other things, vulnerable populations. It doesn't mean that they impact you exactly the same every time, but we wanted to group them into one category to help have that conversation so that you didn't choose both of them and feel like you were duplicating efforts. It also allowed you to speak to some of the other hazards that do actually affect your community in a very unique way. So for instance, drought and affecting water quality and brush fires or heat waves, and how that affects at a different season our populations. And then vulnerability is a really big one. So when we talk about what we went through the exercises, our vulnerability definition was, how the system is susceptible to and unable to cope with the adverse effects of climate change. So that's what our foundation was in those workshops, and going forward tonight, that hopefully that will help to dispel a couple of myths about the definitions that we use. So looking at the climate change hazards, the first one that we identified with the stakeholders in the months of May and June was intense storms. So again, that's our nor'easters, extreme storms, ice storms, extreme precipitation, these heavy snowstorms that we have. And we see that there's been a 70% increase in the amount of specifically around precipitation. And it's falling in heavy rain events. And a lot of them have, and we talked actually, I was talking to Sylvia before, is it's not just the impact of the amount of rain, it's the amount of rain in a small period of time. And that there could be droughts in between. And so these impact our communities because of our sewer systems and our piping and our infrastructure not being able to handle that amount of rain in such a short, or precipitation, I should say, in such a short amount of time. As many of us remember, it was only even a year ago that we had 4 nor'easters within very short amount of weeks. And the big thing there is our ability to recover from those things. When we're hammered so quickly after one storm, our ability for not just vulnerable populations, but all of us, with daycares being one of the bigger ones that come back almost last as one of our community resources. And that's a really big deal because it affects our economy, it affects us being able to go to work personally, it affects the things and services that we need. So it's important to remember that these things happening within short periods of time really does impact us. And then the frequency and intensity, as I keep mentioning, but those are predicted to continue. And then to speak to more to that precipitation piece, you'll see here the average. It doesn't mean that we're not having rain, but the average, we're seeing more as of basically the 1980s. Over the last, so what is that, 20 years, 20 to 30 years, that's predicted to increase. And I'd encourage you to take a look at the Climate Central if you want to play around with some of the impacts, the hazard impacts, because it allows you to actually look at Boston Central and the variety of different things that we're going to talk to tonight, and especially if you are involved in climate work, they have a lot of great slides that can speak to some of these impacts and help you with your presentations as well. And then in those workshops with the stakeholders back in June, some of the impacts that we specifically honed in on were to critical facilities, we mentioned that, to power and utilities, so downed wires because of ice storms, just loose infrastructure in general. I know I've seen bowed power lines still in the summertime, and there's no ice storms, so wind storms and whatnot, that could also be included in intense storms. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the winter. And our communications, so how we're able to not just communicate with each other, but how stores can communicate with their customers, or how the emergency systems can communicate to people. And a lot of people still have landlines, so that's really important too to keep in mind. Water quality in both Lake Quannapowitt and in Crystal Lake, and then our school and business closures. Those were 2 big discussion items as well. And talking with businesses in downtown as we start to work more with Wakefield, it is obvious that they've felt some of those impacts, so they definitely would like to be involved, and we're going to be engaging the business community in this project over the next couple of months as well. So the next climate hazard is flooding, and we do have that in the back there. So in 2010, we were seeing a lot of rain and a lot of precipitation in that year. In Middlesex County alone, we were seeing over $35 million of damage because of that flooding. So again, a big economic impact, and that's probably just the numbers that we can actually count. That's probably not the secondary numbers, again, from closures of daycares and businesses having to close secondarily because they just don't have access to the resources and the types of things they need to be able to get their business back up and going again. And again, that frequency and intensity is really important. And as the committee, the stakeholders looked, they looked at this, of the impacts. They were looking at the sewer overflows and contamination, especially to our water quality, or to our drinking water, but flooding, backed up toilets, a lot of different impacts from that when we have flooding situations. Both the Saugus and the Mill River were highlights of that discussion as well, especially because it tends to become a lot more straightened and streamlined as it goes into Saugus, so backing up into Wakefield. So that riverine flooding is really important to remember, and how that affects not just our water resources and our wetlands, but also people's backyards and our streets, our evacuation routes, really, when it comes down to it. And the roads heaving and buckling was also a common discussion as well, and the quality of our roads, because obviously we need those in order to evacuate in cases of an emergency, but also to travel from here to there. And the wear and tear that it takes on a car, I thought I lost one of my tires in another community earlier today when I was driving, and that's really a lot of the cause of because of flooding, or at least heavy water on our roads. The third climate impact is drought. So just actually several years ago, over half of the state was considered in a drought situation in the month of October, which really has an impact on a lot of things. But here in Wakefield, what we talked about specifically, and again, there's more impacts up here, was on Crystal Lake and the fact that manganese is a common element in the water itself in Crystal Lake. And when there's a drought situation, that manganese is more available, which basically puts you in a bottled water situation, and so in a boil situation. And so that's obviously of concern is a water quality, which I would have connected drought to that, but according to your public works, that is a concern. And some of the other impacts that we discussed were increased brush fires, especially in drier wetland areas, and then a lack of flow in your streams, which is causing algal blooms. So to folks who really love Lake Quannapowitt, you don't want to necessarily be in a situation where you're swimming and boating in a stream or a water body that has an algal bloom. So really important to remember. And so that's obviously effects on recreation. I'm sure it's effect on some of our wildlife as well. And our last climate trend is heat waves, which is going to be on our corner up here. We're projected to see an impact in the number of days that we're going to experience heat waves, which is anything over 90 degrees. So right now we're looking at about 8 days over 90 degrees, and towards the end of the century or mid-century up to 30. So more than doubling the number. And then obviously more than tripling the number by the end of the century, so 2030. 2100. So important to remember, because again, our vulnerable populations are the ones we need to be thinking about, and not just vulnerable populations. Actually, in our group that I was in with Jen, we were talking about people who work outside in the parks and rec departments, our utility workers, people who that is their livelihood, is to be outside. And so how can they actually do their work and maintain a quality of work life if in those kind of conditions? And so that's predicted to increase by 20%. The other way is we're also seeing warmer winters. So unfortunately, and again, those trends are on Climate Central if you want to check into them even more about what we're seeing with those warmer winters. We didn't dig into that too much at the workshops, but the scare, I guess, into a lot of folks, or at least the shock, would be what that would look like for us if you wanted to kind of put ourselves in another climate. And they're saying by the end of the century, as projections go with a higher emissions scenario, we could see ourselves like the climate in South Carolina by the end of the century. And it's also important that, so we're looking at adaptation, and we're looking at the ways that we can adapt to and be less vulnerable to these climate impacts, but it's also important to remember the mitigation side. And so again, and I know a lot of you are probably already understand what that means, but reducing our greenhouse gas emissions will hopefully put a little bit of a damper on some of the issues. And so we see what the variety of different emissions scenarios look like in the chart here, but the big message is we also need to look at the ways to cut our carbon footprint. And our individual as well as community-wide and region-wide and statewide footprint. So we're not using that as part of the discussion today, but we do believe that that's just as important. We just wanted to make sure we mentioned that as part of this presentation. And then the impacts from heat waves from those workshops that we discussed, lack of air conditioning can really exacerbate currents, and this is in any population, but especially our vulnerable populations, heat-related illnesses. It is leading to decreased productivity in our schools. Some of our schools do not have air conditioning, and as we look into those days that are increasing over 90 degrees, if we're looking at 48 days, there's only so many in the summertime where those kids are off, so that means that in both the September and the May-June timeframe, those kids are in schools without air conditioning. So important to increase their productivity so we can bring those smart kids into our workforce. It's also a favorable climate for bacteria and some invasive species. We've seen tick-borne illnesses and more issues around mosquitoes. And then increasing our AC use. So again, it's kind of that 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. We need the AC to prepare our vulnerable populations and keep people out of harm. But unfortunately, that could also put us in a brownout situation where we're losing electricity. So all these are things that we need to balance, and it was a big focus of discussion, and I think going forward, it's something that Wakefield should continue to take into consideration. So we had 3 different buckets that we looked at in our workshops, infrastructure assets, and your environmental assets, and your societal or society economic assets. And so some of the themes that were part of that were your stormwater management, looking at energy efficiency, again, so back to that idea of using more AC, how can we counterbalance that with using smarter AC units, for instance, or finding ways to withstand a 72 degrees instead of having it be 68, or what does that look like, smarter appliances, et cetera. Renewable energy, thinking about solar systems, de-icers, and salts for our winter time to prepare for some of those crazy back-to-back storms that we do have, and looking at asset management for your water and sewer. The environmental themes focused on our lakes, again on stormwater management. That seemed to be a theme for all of the groups. Floodplain management, especially around Lake Quannapowitt. There was a big discussion around green infrastructure, and there's a study going on right now and a big focus on implementation. You'll see that in one of the actions next. And your drinking water, which is important. Not a lot of communities have a surface water drinking source, so that's it can be vulnerable, but it can also be something that is a strong suit as well. So how do you manage that correctly? And then societal, we've talked a lot about vulnerable populations, so our seniors and our youth. People experiencing homelessness is a really important thing to remember as well. Small businesses, especially folks who might not be able to get back up on their feet as quickly as those with stronger resources. New businesses especially, new small businesses. But prioritizing services to the vulnerable populations was definitely one of the themes. And our top actions, so again, I grouped them into the 3 categories, if you will, that we talked about, was constructing a new DPW facility, again, focus on energy efficiency and solar, looking funding for road rehab, especially for those potholes and the things that the winter time that's causing the heaving and frost heaving and basically ruining our roads, developing an inventory of at-risk populations. It does change, and again, it's not just people who are elderly, but also people with disabilities that we need to be thinking about. So keeping that inventory up to date is really important so we know who to check on in case of an emergency. Installing generators, we talked about AC, but we also need generators that are at some of our facilities, especially with those brownout situations. And then we talked about developing an emergency equipment exchange program where people could get things like sump pumps or generators or backup batteries, things like that at a discount and or at least in a central spot where they knew that it was quality, they knew there was access to it, but that could be something the town could work on. And then again, on the environmental side, really focus on Lake Quannapowitt and Crystal Lake, the protection overlay zone, creating something that looks at the entire watershed, if you will, of the Lake Quannapowitt area, and then pursuing water supply land for protection around Crystal Lake. So I mentioned some of the solutions, and this is actually a state priority, so it's not that it's not important, but we're ensuring that every community understands that all of the solutions that they'd like to see, especially for grant funding, have some sort of nature-based solution incorporated into that. So how do we make sure that open space is preserved and maintained to protect our water supplies, as well as protect us from flooding, to protect, obviously our way of life. Open space is a very prized possession in many communities, and not many have a lot of the great open space that you guys do. So it's really important to make sure that that's protected. Ecosystem restoration, so bringing things back to be able to handle and weather those storms that we're getting and the intense weather. And then low impact development, so making sure that the weather that we do get, that we're not just paving our roads, so we're looking at pervious pavement, or we're looking at swales and other sorts of technology that can let that water sink in instead of flowing into our sewers and our water bodies for that matter. And there are a variety of different benefits from that, and I probably am speaking to the choir on a lot of these things, but avoided costs like flooding, and how it keeps our neighborhoods safe, especially in areas where it's prone to flooding right now. And then our watersheds and our water bodies are environmental services, and they help to maintain and to reduce flooding overall. So it's important to keep these things in mind as we develop better solutions to manage these climate hazards. So we talk about chronic stressors in our lives as well, and how those play into how people are more vulnerable or stronger to climate hazards. And so these stressors, which many of us face every day, some of them are more exacerbated or chronic, and so we need to keep these things into consideration as climate hazards become even more part of our lives, because the folks that feel these things are going to have a less ability to be able to adapt and to handle some of those things. And they range from things like not having a big enough budget, or maybe losing their job, to feeling, oh, apologies, I don't know what just happened there. Feeling like that something's ruining their quality of life. So maybe they're in an area where they're next to a highway and their air quality is not as good. So these things can really cause a lot of stresses that reduce our ability to be able to adapt to common situations. And to help you build a more resilient future and a resilient community all over. So our definition for resilience, or the general one, is about surviving and thriving regardless of the challenge, and that bouncing forward, not just back. So how can we recover, but also recover to be even stronger than we were before? And it may not be in the same shape that it was before. Maybe a business isn't quite in the same condition that it was before. They don't have as many employees, or maybe they have more employees, or maybe your house is smaller, but it's a stronger house. But how can we actually bounce forward? And then the 100 Resilient Cities, I don't know if anyone ever was following the progress of the project, but they have a term around urban resilience, which we like to use this with a lot of our communities. Apologies, this has a mind of its own today. I'll use this definition especially because it's important for us to make sure that we're not just thinking of resilience as in the smaller definition, but how we include the socioeconomic, the environmental, and the economic pieces. So it's very similar and akin to sustainability, but again, how we're bouncing forward, keeping those three in mind and as our pillars. So next steps for Envision Wakefield Resilience. So we did some community workshops, as we mentioned, back in May and June. We are also, as part of this project, working with Claire and her team to update and make sure that the multi-hazard mitigation plan also incorporates the work from the MVP. That's the state's encouraging those two planning processes, if you will, which usually either run parallel or sometimes opposite each other, to be done simultaneously, because ultimately they're trying to get to the same place, which is a resilient community that's able to withstand all hazards. So that's in the process, and we'll be finalizing that next month. We also are meeting with a variety of different stakeholders, both now and into the future through January of this project. And you're currently at the listening session. So all of this will be combined into a final report, which will be submitted to the state to make you a certified MVP community. But you also got some additional funding for us to work for KLA to specifically work with Claire and her team and the rest of the town, as well as all the partners. We've been working with the Environmental Sustainability Committee. We're going to be at the Chamber next week at the Bring Your Own Breakfast, and we're hopefully working with the Food Pantry. We're working on a CERT training. I almost said CPAT. A CERT training with Tom Walsh. So trying to get out there as much as possible to work on engaging the community to help you build a more resilient Wakefield. So community engagement is a common piece of this. You might have seen the survey that's up in the front. So we're encouraging you to take the survey so we can get some feedback from you on that. Doing some pop-ups. We were just at Festival Italia. I don't know if anyone saw our booth and was able to come by, but those types of things are ways that we're encouraging you to engage with us, and ways that we can get your feedback on this project. There is a website on the town's website, Envision Wakefield Resilient. And then, as I mentioned, we're aligning this work with existing efforts. So the current hazard mitigation plan, the Environmental Sustainability Committee, Complete Streets program, and then also the final will really be to confirm your hazards, which we've done here, identify the vulnerabilities, which we did through the workshops, and the final recommendations that we went through those three categories will result in a resilience framework, so basically a set of criteria that you can use to assess projects on how resilient they are, and how they're going to help you become a more resilient community. And then a way that you can annually report to the community-wide how you're doing in meeting those resilience criteria. And this is the website for Resilient Wakefield. All right, I'm going to stop. I know I just spoke a lot. I'm going to do a time check as well. I think we're doing pretty good. Were there any questions specifically before we move into the fun part, which is our activity tonight? And we're very much looking forward to your feedback and engaging on these 4 hazards. Were there any questions? All right, wow, that's great. All right, so as I've mentioned over the course of the presentation, there are 4 stations, 4 hazards, I should say. We have one station for each hazard. We'll have Mike in the back with flooding and intense storms. I'll be over here with drought, and Maggie will be over here with heat waves. And each of these stations is asking what concerns you most about this hazard, what could be done to help your community members, whether that's yourself or your neighbors or just any residents in the community, be better prepared for that specific hazard, and what actions have you already taken or that you'd be willing to take. So maybe a commitment piece if you want to, and you can take a selfie next to it, that you'd be willing to take yourself to better prepare for this hazard. And again, if you didn't happen to memorize those details that I mentioned about each hazard, feel free to take a look at some of those impacts. We have probably actually quite a bit more on each one, so we didn't bore you too much with the presentation piece, but familiarize yourself with those. You can see that your town manager already did take this challenge at Festival Italia, and this is what it's going to look like. So there'll be sticky notes that you can use, or you can write on as well if you'd like, if that's easier for you to write on the board itself. But feel free to take a sticky, spend as much time as you'd like on each station, or if you want 15 minutes, but we're going to wrap this up in about an hour. And I can do a time check if we see that people are getting stuck at the stations, but we do hope that you travel to each one if you have a chance to tonight. Absolutely.
Are you going to bring us back as a group after we do that?
That's a great question.
What people's suggestions were?
We were going to, but we decided that we wanted you to be free range tonight. So we're not going to gather back again. But so if you have questions, you can feel free to come to myself or Claire or Maggie or Mike or anyone for additional questions.
And there will be pretty constant updates on the town website and also our Facebook page. So if you go to the town's Facebook page, there will be more information there, which we'll report back and let people know what came up this evening.
That's right.
Then can you just explain how our input tonight would
Yes.
enhance or change or reprioritize, or what it would do to what you've already identified as priority?
That's a great question. So it'll be included in the final report, and then we'll also be using those themes to help us develop what I mentioned here on this climate resilience framework. So where we see there are priorities, we can start to group those into, for instance, if open space is bubbling up to the top as a big priority, then how can we create that as a criteria for you to use to measure how projects are being approved or not approved for the town? Stormwater management seems to be coming up as one too, so we would use that to help you help the town assess projects. So we're going to see what your highlights are as you go through those, and also could help us to reprioritize some actions as well, because that's one of the things on number 3 is around actions. But yes, we're definitely taking these very seriously. All right. Any other questions? Oh, I wanted to mention, I meant to have this. So if you need to for any reason, and these are also writable as well if you'd like to draw on them. If you need to reference these for anything on any of these, or want to circle a specific spot that you have a concern about, please feel free to do that as well. And there's 2 maps. There's one here and one here. All right. With that, free range.